Shalom Aleichem, welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs. And as always, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual theater for this evening's program. Undzer, Bibliotek, Montreal's Jewish Public Library at the Center of Yiddish Culture with Sebastian Schulman, Rivka Augenfeld, and Sonia Bloom. Before we get started, just to note, your video will be off and your audio muted throughout the program. You may send us any questions via the question panel at the lower right of your screen. We ask that you keep questions short and refrain from comments so we can get to all the questions this evening. I'm delighted to introduce this evening's host, Sebastian Schulman. Sebastian is a literary translator from Yiddish and other languages. From 2017 to 2022, he served as the executive director of CLES Canada, a leading organization in Yiddish arts and culture. His original writing and translations have appeared in Two Lines, Words Without Borders, Amli, Electric Literature and Elsewhere. His translation of Spomenka Stymek's Esperanto language novel, Croatian War, Nocturnal, was published by Phonem Media, Deep Vellum, in 2017. Sebastian is an alum of the Yiddish Book Center and served as the center's director of translation. He lives in Montreal, Quebec, and Seb, it goes, not Sebastian, but Seb to me, it goes without saying that it is always a pleasure to host a visit with you, and this panel is especially exciting for us to be presenting.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa. It is, like you say, it's always a pleasure to be back at the center. Really feels like coming home, and especially tonight because I'll sort of be bringing together two of the institutions which have shaped me as a person, as a Yiddish culture professional, and I'm sure for so many people in our audience tonight as well. So thank you.
And the virtual mic goes over to you.
Thank you so much. So I would like to introduce my fellow panelists for the evening, if they could shuffle their way up to our virtual stage. Rivka Augenfeld and Sonia Bloom. It is really, really an incredible pleasure to be here with both of you. People who I have worked with, collaborated with in different capacities in very different ways, and to see you, all three of us, come together tonight is a real pleasure. So I will introduce both of them tonight, or excuse me, right now, but we will see different combinations of each other on the screen throughout tonight's presentation. Let me first introduce Rivka Augenfeld, somebody who has served as a mentor to me, as a guide, a Wegweiser in this world. Rivka Augenfeld has been a member of the Montreal Jewish Public Library since her mother, Liba Augenfeld, wheeled her through the front door at the age of 2. I won't say anything about your age, Rivka, but that was some years ago. The JPL, the library, quickly became a place of learning, fun, and inspiration. Guided by her parents and her uncle, she started reciting Yiddish poems at various literary events and Churban commemorations at the library, and she was soon involved in planning these programs as she grew up. She's been a member of the library's board of directors, an officer, and she has helped guide efforts to make the JPL a sustainable organization with an enduring future. During her ongoing term as the chair of the Yiddish Program Committee, she continues to have a hands-on role in preparing a variety of Yiddish-themed events for the Jewish Public Library. On the other side, or perhaps related, not perhaps, very much related, Rivka also has a career of over 45 years ensuring adequate services to immigrants and refugees. And she is one of the leaders of a large network of organizations here in Quebec and across Canada that advocates for human rights for immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. And in 2015, she was one of 40 people honored to mark the 40th anniversary of Quebec Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Het is een echter COVID te zijn, toe met zeer Rivka Augenfeld dank. On the other side of my Zoom screen, I don't know about yours, is Sonia Bloom. Sonia Bloom is one of these people who was once a student and is now a colleague, which is always such an honor and such a pleasure, and makes me feel a little old sometimes. Sonia received her BA from Oberlin College in 2018 with majors in comparative literature, Hispanic studies, Latin American studies with a concentration in literary translation. She has since worked as a museum educator, language tutor, and translator in New York City and Buenos Aires. Sonia was a 2021-2022 Yiddish Education and Translation Fellow here at the Yiddish Book Center, and she continues as the Yiddish Education Specialist, assisting in teacher training, program planning, and activity design. And we will hear a little bit later tonight about work she does supervising ongoing work by Steiner Summer Program students on the Yiddish Book Center's Francis Brandt online Yiddish audio library. Thank you both so very much. Tonight's presentation with our three panelists will be in 3 acts. Act 1 will be just me. I will present the history of the Jewish Public Library. Why is this and how did this institution become a center for global Yiddish culture? In Act 2, I'll invite Rivka back onto the stage, who will share her firsthand memories of life at the library. And then in Act 3, I will bring Sonia to join the both of us, and she will share about her work and about the work of the center, preserving some of the audio archival holdings of the library. So I'm going to ask Rivka and Sonia if you would now leave the stage. And I will, just bear with me one moment. I will share my screen here. And I would like to introduce us to a little bit of the auf ein Fies, as you say in Yiddish, a brief overview of the Yiddish Center that is Montreal's Jewish Public Library. Is Loma Onheben fin Onheb. Let's start at the beginning. For those of you who are new to the Jewish Public Library, who might not have heard of it before, some basic facts. What is the Jewish Public Library of Montreal? Today, it is a quintilingual library that reflects the diversity of Montreal's Jewish community. Those 5 languages are Yiddish, Hebrew, English, French, and Russian that constitute the main languages of the collections, as well as the programs that the library presents. It is the largest publicly circulating collection of Judaica in North America, and I believe anywhere outside the state of Israel. It is a venue for world-class literary events. It is a research institution and archive par excellence, and it is a celebrated center for Yiddish culture. As we talk about what that all means and how that all came to pass, I want you to keep in your mind this tension about the Jewish Public Library, but about Yiddish culture writ large. This is an institution which is deeply local. It reflects the history of the city of Montreal, of its Jewish community, of the people who go in and out of its doors every day. And yet, it is also a global institution. It serves a public, not just in the city where it's located, but for Yiddish culture, workers, Yiddish speakers, Yiddish people of all kinds, anyone interested in Yiddish culture all over the world. So we're playing with this tension. We are dressing locally, thinking globally, dressing Canadian, thinking Yiddish. The Jewish Public Library was founded in 1914, a product of Eastern European Jewish migration to Montreal. The community of Jews in Montreal in the late 19th and early 20th centuries has sometimes been called the third solitude. These Jews arrived in Canada, in Quebec, in Montreal, between two groups. Society at the time was split between Protestant Anglophones and Catholic Francophones. And they were called famously les deux solitudes, the two solitudes of Quebec life. There were parallel institutions, schools, hospitals for these groups. And according to the stereotypes, but also very much based in reality, there was often little interaction between these groups. And when there was, it would often be moments of friction. Eastern European Jews arrived to Montreal and quickly found that they were unable to fit into these categories. And so built an incredibly robust network of institutions in the Yiddish language: newspapers, schools, theater groups, cultural groups, and cultural institutions, practical institutions to serve their needs. And these immigrants came and settled in the geographic center of the city, on and around Boulevard Saint-Laurent, what is called sometimes the main St. Lawrence. And this was literally between the Francophones of the east side of the island and the Anglophones on the west side of the island. And they earned the name sometimes of the third solitude. While they were building these institutions, there were many attempts at establishing a library. Multiple groups attempted to do so, but most of the time they fell through for a lack of resources. And it wasn't until multiple groups came together, and when I say multiple groups, I mean primarily political parties, different kinds of interest groups, came together with the largest Yiddish newspaper in the city, Der Kennender Adler, the Canadian Eagle, and they pooled their resources together, and they created a small library of 500 books that was called the Yiddish Volksbibliotek, the Jewish public library, the Jewish people's library. And it had a very modest beginning. It was in a cold water apartment on St. Urban Street. And as I say, with only about 500 books donated from all these different parties and institutions. In these very early years, something of note is that even though there were all these different ideological strains and attitudes towards Yiddish, Yiddish itself was incredibly prominent. All of the speakers and users of the library, all of the users of the library were speakers of Yiddish, and Yiddish sort of held a special place there. And the library succeeded to a certain extent because it met people in an ideological middle ground. These conflicts between Yiddish organizations that are so famous, two Jews, three opinions, of course happened in Montreal too, but somehow the library was able to be a sort of middle ground space. And there's been some work on this in the scholarship, and they point to the outsized role of labor Zionism, the Polizian Party, which was both Zionist, but made room for Yiddish in their political platform as the language of the Jewish worker. And the labor Zionists were in some ways themselves in an ideological middle ground. The library quickly grew, and it was far more than a library as it grew. It was a place of social, cultural, and educational enlightenment for Jewish immigrants all over the city. They didn't necessarily have access to all of the institutions of Protestant and Catholic life, although many Jews did attend the English language Protestant schools, but the library was a place where they could get help, where they could learn to navigate their new home, where they could engage with Yiddish literature, Jewish texts, everything. And it became not just the Yiddish Volksbibliothek, there was also what was called der Volksuniversität, the People's University, which strove to give education to all that came. And the Volksuniversität was very much, it started and stopped over the years, but was famously revived in the 40s by Melech Rabich, the great Warsaw Yiddish poet. From its very beginning, the library had an emphasis on its youngest readers, on the future of its Jewish community. And I find this statistic astounding, that by 1920, 10% of all the books in circulation were for children. And it was at the nexus of a local literary scene that was slowly growing in Montreal. And just to name two writers whose names you might have heard, who were particularly prominent in Yiddish life in the interwar period, Ida Maze, a poet who was known as the den mother of Yiddish Montreal. She had a salon in her home, located not far from the Jewish Public Library, where people came together, writers interfaced, new works were premiered, new writers were galvanized in that space. And another very prominent writer is Yud Siegel, J.I. Siegel, who was Montreal's premier Yiddish poet of the time. And Rivka Augenfeld, in her work on Jewish Montreal of the period, characterizes Yiddish Montreal as a peripheral center for Yiddish. It's not one of the main centers for Yiddish, but it is in this global network, this widening web of global Yiddish culture. And you see different ways that manifests itself. Perhaps most famously, in 1915, only 1 year after the library is founded, the library brought Shalom Aleichem to the city of Montreal for a sold-out performance at the Princess Theater, 1,200 seats, right in the center of the city on St. Catherine Street. Several decades later, this commitment to not just the local, but the global Yiddish culture could be seen in programs like the 1944 launch of Jewish Book Month. And this is an institution that is still with us today, not just at the library, but all over the world now. And the very first year that Jewish Book Month was announced by the library, the theme was Das Buch bei Jiden über Gor der Welt. The book, the Jewish book all over the world. Here's some photos to illustrate what was going on in this period. You'll see many photos tonight, all of which come from the Jewish Public Library archive. On the right, you see these two fedoraed gentlemen. The one with the glasses is Yud Siegel himself, as I said, interwar Montreal's most prominent Yiddish poet. And standing next to him is Itzik Mangid, the very famous Yiddish poet. This photo is actually just after World War II, but it sort of symbolizes the connection of Montreal to the greater world of Yiddish. In the upper left corner, you see this group of children walking through this exhibit of books. This comes from the very first Jewish Book Month exhibit. You can see signs, books from Asia, Africa, Australia, and Eretz Yisrael. They had books, Yiddish books from all over the world, and Poilm is also in the back there. Below that, in the left corner, is Ida Maze, the den mother of Yiddish Montreal, and next to her are three dapper-looking gentlemen. In the center is Shalom Aleichem himself, with leaders from the Jewish Public Library. Here we have the ex libris from the Jewish Public Library at the end of the interwar period. And what I find so alluring about this image is that the Yiddish, even in the English version of the ex libris, the Yiddish is still the most prominent way that the library refers to itself. It's still on top. It still has pride of place. As we move forward in time to the post-war period, Montreal moves from being a peripheral place in global Yiddish culture to being a true center. This is a time of incredible change within the Jewish community of Montreal itself, as well as in Quebec and Canada writ large. And the library reflects these changes. Within the Jewish community, the original immigrant generations of Ashkenazi Jews become highly anglicized, and they become the embourgeoisement. They become more wealthy, more well-to-do. And this changes the character of the community quite a lot. At the same time that this is happening, Montreal becomes the third receiving community of Holocaust survivors. After the State of Israel and after New York, more Holocaust survivors come to Montreal than anywhere else in the world. And this new wave of Yiddish-speaking immigrants builds upon the institutions that were built by previous generations. And they built upon these institutions, and they strengthened them as they did so. And among these immigrants were some luminaries, people who had reputations as authors and artists before the war, new talents that were emerging during and just after the war, such as the poet Rachel Korn, a personal favorite of mine, Chava Rosenfarb, the novelist and poet, and Dora Wasserman, who studied with the great Shlomo Michaels in the Yiddish theater in Moscow and founded a Yiddish theater that still exists this day here in Montreal. There was an organization called the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction Incorporated that was founded just after World War II that dealt with Jewish cultural artifacts, books, all kinds of irreplaceable cultural material in Europe. And when owners couldn't be found or institutions could not house them, they were sent elsewhere in the world. And the Jewish Public Library Archives was designated as one of the inheritors of European Jewish culture after the war. This confluence of factors gave Montreal a unique face on the global Yiddish scene after World War II. And I argue that it moved from being a peripheral point in the global Yiddish network to being a true center of global Yiddish culture. And we see this if you look at the list of events that the Jewish Public Library hosted in the post-war period, you see almost every great Yiddish writer of the latter half of the 20th century, Yiddish writers, artists, intellectuals, not even just from the Yiddish world, but from all aspects of Jewish life. And recordings of so many of these programs are now available through the Yiddish Book Center's website, the recordings that were made at the Jewish Public Library. And there were three sort of ingredients that made this possible. This shift from periphery to center, this blooming of Yiddish culture after the Holocaust. One, and most importantly, is the audience. There is, you can hear it in these recordings, in these programs, the audience is ready, is hungry for these programs. They have the appetite. They're not just present, they're engaged. And then you have the talent. You have people who are ready to organize, ready to create, ready to develop culture in their new home in Montreal. That's not the only change occurring. At the same time that you have Jews assimilating into English, Holocaust survivors arriving and building Yiddish culture, you also have an influx of French-speaking Jews coming from North Africa to Montreal. And so the composition of the Montreal Jewish community is going through an incredible transition, and the Jewish Public Library is reflecting that. In the back of this slide, you see a building that was purpose-built by the Jewish Public Library. It took them 8 years to raise the money. The building is still here today, and it housed the Jewish Public Library from 1953 to 1967. The fact that they could build this building is testament to the success and the importance of the library. And it was still in the old immigrant neighborhood, and as I say, still stands at the corner of Esplanade and Mount Royal, right in the shadow of the mountain. This was also in a moment of incredible change in Quebec society, a period known in French as La Révolution Tranquille, or the Quiet Revolution, when Quebec nationalism emerged as a force in society, and Canadian identity in the rest of Canada also emerged. Canadianness was not something that was articulated in a strong way. And you have this entire realignment of what Quebec society and Canadian society look like. And coming out of this period, you have the policies of official bilingualism. Canada becomes an officially bilingual country with English and French as the two official languages, and a policy of multiculturalism, which promotes immigrant cultures and seeks to, in the United States, we talk about the melting pot. In Canada, we talk about the salad bowl, where immigrant groups get to retain their culture, their flavor in a broader mosaic, in a broader salad, in a broader recipe. And there's this question that remains: where do the Jews fit in? Many Jews react negatively to the rise of nationalism in Quebec and leave Montreal for other parts of Canada, for other parts of North America, other parts of the world. But there's also great opportunity that many other Jews see as the orientation of society shifts from religion to language. For many Yiddish culture activists, this is also a time of great excitement. And there's a new book about to come out about this period by Simon Pierre Lacasse, who is a professor at Concordia University here in Montreal. I highly recommend his work because it is shifting the way that we understand Jewish life in the period of the Quiet Revolution. And just some photos to illustrate this period. Up at the top, I've created what looks like a debate that never occurred. But on the left, you have Rachel Korn, the great Yiddish poet who moved to Montreal after the war. She survived the war in Soviet Central Asia, then moved to Sweden for several years and ended up living the rest of her life in this city. To her right is René Lévesque, who was one of the architects of Quebec nationalism and later became the premier of Quebec, a separatist who wanted Quebec to become its own nation. And he's pictured here at Le Cercle Juif, which was a early Francophone, French-speaking Jewish cultural group, which he visited and interacted with. Below René Lévesque, on the right, you have Chava Rosenfarb, the Yiddish novelist and poet. On the left, you have the entrance to the Jewish Public Library in 4 languages: English, French, Yiddish, and Hebrew. And in the center, an iconic photo of the reading room of the Jewish Public Library from the 60s. A man on the right reading Der Kenneder Adler, the Yiddish newspaper, and a nun on the left. I don't know what language she's reading it in, but perhaps it is not Yiddish. I wanted to, before we close this first act, just bring up a map that demonstrates some of the shifts in Montreal Jewish life. You see here this sequence of dots where it says Notre Dame Basilica, the number 3, and you move in a diagonal line up towards this dot over the G in Grand Bibliotek. These are the locations of the Jewish Public Library before the war, and that final dot above the G is where its purpose-built building was located. You see that this is all on the eastern side of the mountain. This slightly darker gray blob in the center of our map is the mountain that gives Montreal its name. As Jews, the Ashkenazi community becomes more anglicized, becomes more well-to-do, and leaves its immigrant past behind, the community and the Jewish Public Library move to the west side of the mountain, where it says Montreal Metro Snowden, and then slightly above it, under St. Joseph's Oratory, where it is located today in the Jewish Federation building. And just a final note on what the Jewish Public Library is like today. It continues to reflect the changing face of Montreal Jewry, which is incredibly multilingual, incredibly diverse demographically, young and old, religious and secular. There are 5 cultural committees reflecting the 5 languages of the library: English, French, Yiddish, Hebrew, and Russian. Russian was added once there was an influx of Jewish immigrants from the former Soviet Union in the 1990s. There is an extensive children's library, which has books, DVDs, all kinds of materials in all 5 of those languages, the Norman Berman Children's Library. And there's all kinds of initiatives. These are just a few that illustrate what the library is like today. The J.I. Siegel Awards, named after J.I. Siegel, of course, that award both local works, the best Quebec book on a Jewish theme every year, and translations of Yiddish or Hebrew literature or translations on a Jewish theme, as well as the best work of Yiddish literature written anywhere in the world. The library has all kinds of digital resources both for the casual reader and for serious research. The JPL archives today consists of over 500 linear meters of records that is used by institutions, researchers, genealogists, just about anybody from all over the world. And it really is a local institution, an institution that reflects the place it is, but an institution with global reach. It is a global institution rooted in its local community. And it is a place, as I said, that is near and dear to my heart, a place that really has formed me as a person. So I will stop there, and I will invite up onto the stage Rivka Augenfeld. Hello, Rivka. Good to see you again.
Yes. Listening to your presentation brought back a lot of memories.
Good. Well, that's exactly what we're going to talk about now is some of your memories. And, you know, I think it's easy to talk about these institutions as these, you know, big, important places in our culture. But one of the reasons I so wanted you here with us tonight is to, you know, talk a bit more personally about about what the library is and has been. And so I'm going to start with a very simple question for you. A big question, but a simple question. How did your family get involved with the Jewish Public Library, and what role did they play there?
Well, first of all, I'm really very, very appreciative of being here and seeing so many people attending this event. I think, as you mentioned in the intro, my parents brought me into the library, more specifically my mother, and it must be said that my mother was from Vilna, my father from Warsaw. So I was already, the joke is from a, mixed marriage, but my mother came out of that incredible Yiddish education that flourished in Eastern Europe between the two world wars, particularly in Vilna, but of course in other cities as well. And she was a library person. In Vilna, she belonged to two libraries because one wasn't enough. And even, after going through the war, and that's where she met my father. It was a big romance. My parents met at the worst of times and lived in their life afterwards in the best of times for them. But my dad was from Warsaw, and also libraries were very important. They were political, but also very much into literature. And even during the short period when they lived as displaced persons, as DPs in Austria, many of people who came to Montreal were in Austria or in Germany right after the war. My mother went to the library there and found the books that she could read. And so coming to Montreal, before we had a real apartment, when we were still roomers, in other words, living not in a room in somebody's apartment, she took me to the library and we became members of the library. So I don't remember this event, but she talked about it all the time. So ever since I can remember, I was going to that library. First, when it was in smaller quarters, and then in the big building that you saw. I think people should know that after what happened, that library, beautiful, beautiful building, was built a little bit too late and it was built by the people who wanted to use it. It wasn't built by people for somebody else. The users built it, but the community, Montreal community, was starting to move west. And very quickly, the people who were the most frequent users of the library were moving away. So the library eventually had to move with them, and we ended up where we are right now. But the building, which was absolutely beautiful, really only had a useful life of about 15 years, which was unfortunate. If we could have picked up the whole building and taken it with us, that would have been the best. But so, and I started reading reading Yiddish books. And also my parents, because they were Yiddishists and Bundists, they had the courage, and it took courage in those days as immigrants to say, we will continue with Yiddish. We won't put Yiddish away because it's an old thing from Europe. Yiddish is here. And so I learned to read. I learned to read very quickly, read Yiddish books. And there were books, I think that certain books I only read in Yiddish. I read Jules Verne, and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea only in Yiddish. I read Victor Hugo in Yiddish. So I'm not the only one. I think that's the important thing to say, is I'm not the only one. And the library was a second home. And at some point, I couldn't do it now because there are many more books, but at some point I finished all of the books in the children's library. And then they had to, with great trepidation, let me into the adult library and follow me around to make sure I wasn't getting anything unsuitable to read. But and my parents also became involved, not just as users, but as organizers, became involved in various committees. And at the same time, the Workman's Circle, the Arbeitering, was just a few blocks away. And I honestly can't remember sometimes which writers or which speakers I heard at the library and which I heard at the Workman's Circle. There was a real circuit there for Yiddish writers. By the way, I'm going to interrupt to tell you that the nun in the picture that you showed earlier was a nun called Sister Marie Noel. And among other things, I don't know if she did it with somebody's help, but anyway, she translated some of Melech Ravich's Yiddish poems into French. So all kinds of very interesting things happened in that library. So, and my mother was very involved in various Yiddish things. We had a program called First Fruits, which encouraged children and young people, adolescents, teenagers from all over the city, not just Jewish schools, but all schools, to submit original work. My mother was the Yiddish editor. She was the Yiddish editor of an amazing book that was published called Folk's Lore, and which was produced for the 75th anniversary of the library. And my father became involved in committees and also eventually the board, and he was the president of the library, of the board of directors, so volunteer in the 70s.
So you alluded in your biography, that we read at the beginning of the evening, a little bit about some of the things that you have done at the library. Could you speak a little bit more about the roles that you have played, both on stage and behind the scene?
As I said, on stage, I can't really tell you which events. Some events when I was a kid, I very early started reciting Yiddish poetry at various events. And I think a lot of that was thanks to my mother, who loved Yiddish poetry, and my uncle, Abba Augenfeld, who was very involved at the library, who had been in amateur theater in Warsaw, a textile worker by day and an amateur actor by night, I think. And my uncle served as our coach, not just to me, but to a whole group of us that some people who are listening out in the audience might know, Anna Fishman-Gonscher and Mindy Spiegel and Razel Kandib and a few others. He was our Yiddish coach for reading poetry. So a lot of it happened at the library, some of it happened at the Workman's Circle, initially probably for various Yisker events, for Holocaust commemoration events, and eventually other, literary events. So I got involved like that, and then got involved. Recently I found a letter congratulating me on becoming a member of the board of directors in 1976. So I was 30 years old then, which will tell everyone how old I am. But so it's not, as we say in French, c'est pas d'hier matin, it's not from yesterday. But and I've been involved in various ways ever since. My parents were at one point the co-chairs. You have to really get along well to be the co-chairs of the Yiddish Programming Committee. It's a testament to their great understanding of what it means to work together, because they did work well together. And so they were the co-chairs of the Yiddish Programming Committee for a long time. And in recent years, I became the co-chair with my wonderful colleague and friend, Eugene Ornstein, who unfortunately left us in Montreal to go and live with his grandchildren in Philadelphia. But we forgive him because it's for the grandchildren. But if he's listening, we still miss him. And so and our Yiddish events at the library have progressed over the years. Of course, once upon a time, it was Yiddish events were entirely in Yiddish. And then bit by bit, they became a mix. And sometimes now our Yiddish events are actually programs in English about Yiddish with some Yiddish thrown in. But what we do that has the most Yiddish in it, and which I think is unique to us, are events we call Yiddish cafes, which are really fun. We do them cafe style, sitting around tables, and we use local talent, people singing, people reading poetry, people reading prose on various themes. The themes that have been the most consistent, we do in February. We don't call it Valentine's Day, we call it the Love Cafe, but we do love poetry and love songs only, and decorate the whole room very love. And the other thing we've done consistently are a Shalom Aleichem event in May, because I think as many people in this audience know, Shalom Aleichem in his will enjoined us to meet on his Yahrzeit and not to grieve and not to mourn, but to read his work. And even he already all those years ago foresaw that there might be a time when people's Yiddish wouldn't be that great. And he said, in whatever language you can, just read my work and enjoy, my time. So we do that, and it's been a great success. So I think these Yiddish cafes have really played an important role in involving people, involving participants, and having a loyal following from the audience.
Absolutely. I'm sitting here smiling and nodding and laughing because I remember going to these events as a student. I've participated in many of them, and very, very warm memories. I'm going to ask you an impossible question.
Okay.
So many years, so many decades of programs.
Yeah.
Is there any program you said you could pick out as your most memorable, as your favorite, as something that left the greatest impression upon you?
Well, there were a number. I can't pick out one, but there were people. We had programs when Elie Wiesel and Rachel Korn were on the same stage together. It's stunning, especially around commemorating the murdered Soviet Yiddish poets. This was, I think we forget how, this happened in 1952. So in 1972, it was only 20 years later, they all knew them personally. And it was very stunning and very sore and very raw and very sad. And you have Elie Wiesel and Rachel Korn on the same stage together, and commemorating this. And Elie Wiesel was a great fan of Rachel Korn's. We had Avram Sutzkever, who came to Montreal, and Abba Kovna, and my parents, as I mentioned, during the war were partisans, and so they were personal friends of these great writers. Avram Sutzkever was a friend, and Abba Kovna, who was one of the leaders of the Vilna partisans, was a friend. And even though Abba Kovna was a Hebraist and in Israel didn't do anything in Yiddish, came to Montreal, and it's in the records, in the archives of that Sonia is going to be speaking about. There is an amazing talk that he gave in Montreal in Yiddish, which is stunning, and it's called Der Nisoyen von Yochid und von Ador, the trials of an individual and a whole generation. And we had great writers who came. Aleph Bet Yehoshua. Now, in what other city than Montreal can you have the same writer give 3 talks in English, French, and Hebrew, right? So there aren't too many cities in this world where that can happen. And Amos Oz. So we had the whole gamut also of Israeli political thought that came out through these wonderful writers, fiction writers. And I'll finish with the fact that we had, and this was an amazing event for the 100th anniversary of the library, which was in 2014. We had a whole bunch of events. There was a wonderful symposium, etc. But what was really wonderful was being feted, if you will. In Quebec, we have something called, for people who don't know, the Bibliotek et Archives Nationales du Québec. So it's the national, in Quebec, the word national is used often to talk about Quebec because we are a nation. And I'm not saying this to make fun, but we have the National Library, Quebec Library and Archives, which is an amazing institution and which really appreciates our library as a library and as an institution with archives. I think we get more appreciation from outside the Jewish community sometimes than inside the community. And they hosted us for a wonderful event. There was an exhibit about the Jewish Public Library at the National Library. There was a wonderful launch. There was, and with a, what do you call it, a 5 à 7, what do we call that in English?
Happy hour.
The happy hour cocktail. And one of the top Quebec writers, Canadian writers, Roch Carrier, who's very known as a children's writer, who spoke about the importance of books. And so that was a highlight, I think, of an institution that appreciated another institution that we are.
Beautiful, beautiful. I want to leave time for our third act. So I'm going to ask you a philosophical question, but zwei Werte.
Yeah.
So I talked a little bit about this tension. I don't know if tension is the right word, but this aspect of the library's character, that it is both local and global. So how do you, as somebody who has been involved with the library your entire life, how do you see the library balancing these two parts of itself?
Well, local has changed tremendously. And by the way, there was a question I saw that somebody asked about why all the books are in the cellar in the library. They're not in the cellar. All the books are in what we call the lower level. And to the person who asked the question, it's not just the Yiddish books, it's all the books. Because we don't have enough space. One of our problems as a Jewish public library now is that we don't have enough space for all the books that we have and all the things that we would like to do in our archives. But I think when the library started, there wasn't that much competition. Montreal had a notoriously non-existent public library sector. There were hardly any public libraries all the way back then. Now we have a very robust public library network in Montreal, in the various boroughs, what we call in French arrondissement. So there are beautiful public libraries all through the city. So people have choices. And people have choices closer to where they live. Ironically, where the library was, that beautiful building that you showed, and where when we had to move, that whole area, which at the time was an immigrant area, is now the very trendy Mile End and Plateau Montréal, where the people who made it trendy can't afford to live anymore. And I think that gentrification thing, I think whoever's listening to us has lived that in their cities. I think it's happened in Boston and New York and in wherever people are. So, but a lot of the people who would be attracted to our library actually live in that area now. And if the library were now back there, we might have a whole different and younger crowd. So it's very ironic. But we are in competition with a lot of other libraries, and we also are in competition with everything that goes on out there. When the library, even the 50s and 60s, we didn't have the kind of media and television and Netflix and ebooks and all of the things that people have access to now, and events that people can go to, whether they're cultural. So the library was a physical place for culture. People now have many, many more choices. So you have to think through, what can we offer that you can't get somewhere else? On the other hand, we are more and more recognized, I think, globally and in the world. And because of the kinds of communications there are now internationally, our archives and our books are accessible. Our rare books are accessible and appreciated. So our archives are solicited from all over the world. We have a wonderful team of of archivists who really serve this international public. And I see that we are being told that we are going overtime. So I think I'm going to stop and let you get to our other panelists.
Okay, thank you very much, Rivka. I'm going to invite Sonia up onto the stage here.
Yes, it is always hard because there's so much to talk about.
So much.
And it's all connected. So tonight I'll be talking about the Francis Brandt online Yiddish audio library, on which you will find many of these events where Rivka recited poetry or introduced some of these wonderful Yiddish writers. This collection consists of over 750 remastered recordings of lectures, readings, and other fun events, of which I will give a little sneak peek, that took place between 1953 and 2005 at the Jewish Public Library of Montreal. 2/3 of these events, of these recordings, are entirely in Yiddish. So not only do they transmit important historical and literary commentary, they give us a window into the lively communal atmosphere. Small asides, audience reactions caught on tape. I keep laughing to myself when there continue to be these moments after long, sometimes verbose introductions to the Yiddish writer who will be giving a reading or lecture. And the first words at the mic after the applause are, "It hört mich." Can you hear me? So they're people too. They're not just authors of the many books that we have at the center or at the library. It's wonderful to hear their voices themselves. And it's also an amazing resource as both a Yiddish learner and a Yiddish educator to have such a wide range of Yiddishes to get to listen to and to have our students listen to and work with. So I will be sharing a few clips. This is only just a tiny, tiny taste of the many recordings that are on the site. So please do take a look and get lost. So the first one that I want to start with is a round table from 1964. Speaking of having amazing figures on stage together, Yiddish writer Melech Ravitch, who Seb mentioned earlier, novelist Adele Weissman, scholar Ruth Weiss, and writer and musician Leonard Cohen gathered to speak on the topic of English Jewish writers and Jewish identification. Here is an excerpt from Leonard Cohen's remarks on the role of the artist as performing a brave task that is destined to be despised. So I'm going to be sharing my audio, so everyone prepare yourselves for some archival dialogue. So it might come in a little loud, and then just adjust with the settings on your computer. One moment. Here is Leonard Cohen in 1964.
The world is hostile not only to the Jewish writer, Miss Wiseman. The world is hostile to the writer. The world is hostile to the poet. The world is hostile to any man who will hold up a mirror to the particular kind of mindless chaos in which we endure. That is the glory of the poet, that is the glory of the writer, that is the glory of the Jew, that he is despised, that he moves in this mirrored exile, covered with mirrors, and as he passes through the communities where he sojourns, he reflects their condition and his condition. To me, his destiny is exile, and his vocation is to be despised. In modern times, two groups of human beings have talked identity incessantly and endlessly at the stars, hesitating only to tune their ears to some cosmic reply which is not forthcoming. The Jews and the Canadians. To be a Jewish Canadian is to really stick your neck out.
I love how he says the phrase Jewish Canadian, and that gets a laugh. That's kind of incredible.
Right. Global and local. And then I'm just going to share one more, which also will transition me into talking just a little bit about the work that we've been doing with this collection in the educational realm, which is a snippet from Rachel Korn giving a reading that is honoring, that's celebrating the publication of what ended up being her last collection of poems called Verbittene Wort, Altered Reality, in 1977. She died 5 years later at the age of 82. And here she seems to conclude her recitation for the evening, and the audience responds by breaking out in gentle song, Lo mir alle Einaim, which is a song I'm sure many people in the audience will also recognize.
Ja, okay.
Wir sind in der Krokussen. Der will einen sehr ja. As meine shit when.
And she then responds by doing one more poem. So this is kind of an ask for an encore, and it's just such a wonderful moment. Yes, I don't know if Seb, did you want
to? I just have goosebumps. That's all I was going to say.
Yeah. And so this was from a literarische Abend, one of these reading events where an author or somebody honoring that author would come and recite different poems. And these are the collection, the subsect of the collection that we've been working with the intermediate students at the Steiner program, our Yiddish summer language intensive that we run every year at the Yiddish Book Center. And they're kind of a few different components, but the way that these recordings are currently on the Yiddish Book Center site are mostly as 1 or 2 very long tracks that were digitized from the tapes. And that can be a little bit hard to navigate. So students who are intermediate Yiddish learners have been listening for individual poems or short stories and have been transcribing titles and actually segmenting the audio so that on the site, bit by bit, we're changing the interface so that you can actually click and listen to one poem from Rachel Korn's reading. The second part of that is using our full text search for everything that has been digitized, the Spielberg library. You can actually search for these poems, and the students have been matching up the text with the authentic recordings. So that kind of tool is invaluable in language learning, to have the text in front of you and to be able to listen. So we're very excited about that.
Goosebumps of an entirely different
Exactly.
kind. I mean,
so keep an eye out, be in touch if you are a Yiddish language learner or teacher out there and are excited about using these recordings for your own learning and teaching.
thank you so much, Sonia. We are going over because our cup overfloweth, but I think we have time for a couple of questions. Rivka, if you want to come back up on stage.
First, a big thanks to all of you. It's an amazing topic. It's an amazing institution with an amazing cultural history, which all of you have contributed to telling that story, both past, present, and future. So I'm going to try to run through some questions kind of quickly. Sebastian, could you include the reference to the new book on the period re-centralization of Montreal in Yiddish?
Absolutely. So the scholar's name is Simon Pierre Lacasse. And the book, I don't know if his book is out yet, but I think it's called something, Les Juifs et la Révolution Tranquille, The Jews and the Quiet Revolution.
Maybe just put it in the chat.
Exactly what I was going to suggest.
For our audience doesn't see that, so sorry. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. But can I just add something?
Sure.
And it's not a Yiddish moment, but it was an incredibly, not just emotional, but a moment of when in the late 70s and during the 80s, when we, as was mentioned, Sebastian in his review, a lot of Soviet Jews and from other East came to Montreal. Thanks to David Roskies and the fact that his sister Eva Raby was then the director of the Jewish Public Library. It's a small world, and many of you people in the audience know David. He got his hands on about 500 or more Russian books for some ridiculous amount, and organized transporting all of these books to Montreal. And to see Russian immigrants, and here's where the other part of my life came in, because at the time I was working just on the next one floor up at Jewish Immigrant Aid Services, to see Russian Jews coming into a library, which they treasured anyway, and seeing books in Russian that they could read without asking permission, without worrying that they were reading the wrong thing, without some commissar coming and looking and judging what they were doing. It was emotionally so powerful and so rich. And I think it bound a lot of people in that community to the library for a very long time. The fact that they had this new and so longed for experience of freedom to read whatever you want to read. It was just stunning. And it continues to this day. We forget that in some countries you can't read what you want. And if we can provide that, it's amazing.
Beautiful.
Yes. A quick question about the community, the current contemporary community. Sebastian, have you found that you think it's as vibrant as it was in the 50s, say, with events and things like that?
Well, I wasn't there in the 50s,
No,
so
but-
I mean, I would riff off of something Rivka said. You know, things change, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that they are less than or worse than. They are just different. And you know, maybe Jewish life in Montreal looks very different. It's not conducted in Yiddish as much. Maybe the library is, you know, its place as an institution is shared with other institutions. But I absolutely think that Montreal has an incredibly vibrant cultural life, Jewish cultural life that is very, very different than anywhere else in North America. Yiddish is sort of, you know, in the United States, Yiddish is this deliberate act. You know, we choose to work in Yiddish, we choose to speak Yiddish, we choose to do Yiddish. And in Montreal, there is that element, but it is also very normalized. Yiddish just is in the city, and that I don't think has changed from the 50s in a very palpable way.
Could I add something to that as well? Just because, you know, we do have a Yiddish speaking community in Montreal, as you have in New York, and the Haredi community, the Orthodox community. We think, and not everyone doesn't come to the library. We have a lot of children who come to the library from Orthodox Jewish families. And during COVID, one of the things I was doing was delivering books to people who couldn't come to the library themselves. And I discovered quite a number of women, mostly women, in the very Orthodox community who were very much looking for books. And they were reading books about everything. They weren't reading religious texts. They were reading novels and mysteries and thrillers and everything you could want. So it gave me a new appreciation and took away some of my little prejudices about what people read where. And so the books are there for everyone.
This may be our last question given time, everybody, for which I apologize. Was the westward shift referred to as the, my Yiddish here, Fenster? What was the nature of the interaction between the assimilating Jews and the Grina?
Well, look, not everyone who moved west assimilated. People moved west and people moved the way they moved in every city, you know, across North America. They moved from immigrant neighborhoods to more affluent neighborhoods, or sometimes not so affluent, but maybe better neighborhoods. And the Hoige Fenster really means the high windows, for those who don't know. It means fancy people. Not everyone who moved was Hoige Fenster, but people did move, and the schools moved with them. We have a lot of the Jewish schools, the Jewish day schools, and because of the particularities of what Sebastian described, we have a very vibrant Jewish day school network in Montreal, which existed again between the polarized Catholic schools and Protestant schools. Those schools moved. Not every, and a lot of the new, when I was working with new immigrants, the new immigrants didn't move to the old neighborhood. They lived in, as well as they could, in also very modest neighborhoods, but they were in the West End. So it's not just about being fancy, moving west.
And I will add this one last question, which I may go ahead and answer for you from the Yiddish Book Center. Someone is asking about the audio recordings. They couldn't quite hear them, but they also wondered where they would find more. And that is on the Yiddish Book Center's website, yiddishbookcenter.org, and look in the collection section of our website for the Francis Brandt online Yiddish audio library. This is an amazing collection of remastered programs from the museum, the Montreal Jewish Public Library. We did this collaboratively, and talk about goosebumps. Yes, Seb, the first time I heard Gladstein's voice, I just couldn't believe I was hearing it. So I want to say, Sonia, thank you to you and all of the students for the work that you're doing to help unearth this collection. Rivka, thank you so much for the continuity and for your sharing stories. I think we have to have you back again, because a whole program, each of you unto yourself. And Seb, again, thanks a million for putting this together and for all you bring to the conversation. Appreciate it and hope to have you back for more. And otherwise, people go on our site and start exploring this incredible collection. You won't disappoint. And also the Sammy Roar, which were part of the Montreal Jewish Public Library. It's part of the website, on the Yiddish Book Center's website. These are all available for you to listen to for free. Can't stress enough how wonderful this collection is and how important this collaboration between the two organizations was. So thank you again. I'd like to thank our producer, Elizabeth Carteropoli, for all of her help behind the scenes with this. Tonight's program is presented as part of the Yiddish Book Center's 2023 Decade of Discovery, Yiddish Around the World, and is part of an ongoing series of programs brought to you, as I like to say, live from the Yiddish Book Center. Please join us on April 27th, next Thursday at 7 p.m. for the program From a Polish Shtetl to Yiddish New York, The Life and Work of Ray Faust, Artist Extraordinary, with Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimlet and Barry Faust, again Thursday, April 27th at 7 p.m. To see the full schedule of events and to register for any and all of our programs, please visit yiddishbookcenter.org/events. And if you find yourself in the neighborhood, please drop by for a visit. We're open Sunday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And we would love to see you. Want to thank all of our members who make all of our ongoing work possible. Please consider becoming a member of the center or donating to support many of our programs. You'll learn more and you can become a member at yiddishbookcenter.org/donate. Thanks again to everybody. Have a good night and see you next Thursday.